What is SS2 predominantly, and who does it apply to?
Sure, thanks, Nick. And really, SS2 is building on many of the regulations we all know and love that are out there today. And I think the narrative I've seen is suggesting it should be clarifying, developing, and modernising the way these things come to bear. And I guess you as a community will be the ultimate judges and arbiters of whether that's been effective. I guess how it applies, I wanted to break into three components. Perhaps the easy bit is who in terms of organisations. So the breadth of financial services, so banks, building societies, investment firms, etc., insurers, and as well as UK branches of overseas companies. So hopefully everybody's familiar with that and you know who you are and whether you sit inside that community or not. Perhaps the interesting piece is the middle component around which arrangements or deals now fall into the scope. I think we're all very familiar with the concept of an outsource or a material outsource being something that has been in the watchful eye of the regulator. But as part of this regulation, we're expanding that scope and thinking about critical, important relationships and arrangements, but particularly there's clarification about non-outsourcing. And I think the kind of overriding principle is if an arrangement, a relationship, a supplier, it forms part of a key dependency in your operation, it should be treated in the same way and have the same rigor and application around it. So I think, for some that might be considered more onerous, but in some ways it helps because it just clarifies the landscape and you don't trip over this outsourcing or non-outsourcing kind of definition. And in fact, in some cases across Europe, there's been some advice to say that all software as a service providers, so SaaS providers, fall into scope. So again, a broadening of the net, I would suggest. Then finally, just in terms of who within your organisation is perhaps worrying about it, sweating about it, awake at night about it. And I think as we become more dependent on third parties, outsourcers for our provision of service, this community definitely grows. And as the regulations become more comprehensive, the kind of depth of expertise we need in an organisation also grows. So many of the communities you see on the screen are definitely captured. I think what's evident to me is that this is something that is not going to be solved or complied with through an individual trying to take it on themselves. It's got to be a cross-functional, divisional team effort to get it right. And delighted the kind of breadth of people we have on the call today are not just from one discipline, they're from multi-disciplines, which I think is exactly the right answer. The one word of caution I'd have with that, when there's lots of characters involved, is there may be lots of contributors, but there needs to be somebody who is taking accountability, responsibility, ownership at a relationship or an arrangement level or an outsource level to make sure these things happen. So in bringing together all those strands of expertise and capability to make sure we do comply. So I would encourage you to be collaborative, but make sure you do have that sense of ownership and single point of accountability within an organisation. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a kind of framework for how it applies, and it's really just a build on some of the regulations that are already in place. We're going to go into more detail as we go through the session around some of the specifics, and really wanted to invite the rest of the panel to contribute any more to that. Or otherwise, Steve, I know you were going to talk about some of how this regulation jives really with some of the other things out there like OpRes.
Some of the things that jump out at me when I read these new legislations is an obvious point, but one that's often overlooked, is they talk about very subjectively about critical and important material. And I think some people are always looking for a classification around what that is, but they leave it down to you have to know your own business enough to qualify what that actually means. And to be honest, that's fair. Right? That's fair. You should know your own business enough to do that. But having worked in some of the largest organisations, for people that have got the accountability and responsibility here, that might not be as clear. So to your point of, you often have to seek help to understand, well, what should be critical and important? What comes through in a supply chain on one side of the business? Is that the dependent on the other side that is a critical and important function that business provides, right? And it's mapping through the organisation, especially larger ones, to determine, this small supplier is a material outsource and critical and important in equal measure. Jesse, Steve, anything to add? Or?
Dan, you've actually stolen some of my commentary in the next slide. But yeah, I mean, this obviously is an extension. It's not just about outsourcers now; it's also about vendors. And actually, a little anecdote: I did some work with the London branch of Middle Eastern Bank not so long ago, and as we went through the full list of suppliers, I'll call them, actually trying to work out which one was a vendor and which one was an outsourcer is itself really quite hard. The rules at that time was only about notifying material outsourcers, but when you get into it, even that determination of whether something's material or not. So on one of the first things you have to do is have an inventory of your suppliers, and you do have to go through that process to classify them as an outsourcer or a vendor, and you do have to go through that process of classifying them as material or not. But in both cases, I'd err on the side of caution. But you've got to start with an inventory of your suppliers, first of all, and often that's absent. On the subject of accountability, and we really do get into the sort of SMCR point, this comment that Dan made earlier on, I'd absolutely share the comment there, which is, I would be encouraging regulated firms to have an SMF responsible for the framework, but that does not mean at that point that they're responsible for overseeing all of the suppliers, vendors, or outsourcers, or otherwise. You've got to then allocate each of those suppliers to individual SMFs depending on what it is they do for you. But it doesn't change the fact that I'd very much recommend firms, as I say, the framework as a whole needs to be owned by an SMF, but each of the underlying suppliers, whether they're an outsourcer or a vendor, need to be aligned to other SMFs depending on what it is they do. And I think if you do that, you get the accountability clear, but equally the delegations and the accountability for the function within the framework.
To keep up with the latest vendor ops news, subscribe here and follow us on LinkedIn. Links in the description below.